Hi, my name is Tony, and this is Every Frame a Painting.
Okay, I'm just joking. This is Federico Chara, and this is my visual essay on film noir. So, film noir. What is film noir? For those of you who have taken any sort of French during high school, the word might ring a bell. It means black, making the literal definition of film noir be black film. So why is this important? According to film critic Paul Schrader, this guy, famous for his work in Taxi Driver, Raging Bull, and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, among many others, film noir cannot be defined as a genre. Instead, it is a style of filmmaking predominantly identified by its dark and claustrophobic tone. As an example, Western films and gangster films fall into their respective genres as they share specific kind of settings and characters. A Western film will take place in some point during the 1800s and be located in the wild American lands west of the Mississippi River. On the other hand, gangster films will most of the time involve one or more, gangsters. However, film noir cannot be identified so easily. Our friend Paul believes that the essence of film noir lays in its tone, the mood, the way it communicates the information to us, and the stories it tells. Film noir does not need to be tied to a specific place in time nor to a specific set of characters, but instead it serves as a framework or recipe the characters are added into. So what is this recipe? Simply take 2 big cups of dark and contrasting light, preferably making it look like nighttime, 1 tablespoon of rain falling into piers or docks, a drizzle of quiet and sneaky acting, an independent, strong female character, a hard-boiled male character, and a gallon of hopelessness, drama, and issues. Note, you do not need to tell the story in chronological order. Mix all of this together and you get a film noir to show all of your friends and family. As you can see, it is the way in which the sound, editing, cinematography, mise-en-scène, as well as narrative form all come together to create a set of specific characteristics which fall under the style of film noir. Now, to fully understand film noir, one must go into more detail and look at each different element and what part it plays in shaping the style. To begin with, film noir lighting is perhaps one of the most characteristic and recognizable elements. It is dark, high in contrast, and does not prioritize the actor over the background. Film noir lighting is said to have been inspired from an earlier style known as German Expressionism. Yes, this movie. Also this one, and this one. It is not hard to find similarities between both styles. For example, in this shot of German expressionistic film Nosferatu. One can notice a variety of interesting characteristics. The first being the little range of gray in the frame. The blacks are very dark, omitting most of the detail, while the whites are very bright, also not registering any detail. Now let's compare it with this shot from Touch of Evil. Here, it is possible to see the same effect. In this shot, the blacks are really black, not showing anything from the background, and while the whites do register a fair amount of detail, they are mostly used to outline the subjects. This allowed the subjects to be distinguishable, but not too visible. Another interesting use of lighting borrowed from the Germans is the way in which darkness engulfs the characters. Not only are the shadows very dark and solid, but they also seem to be taking hold of the characters within the frame. Let's look at these 2 examples. As you can see in both of these examples, the shadows used in the scene are meant to represent a subject in danger. Although both of these examples are quite literal, film noir often lets its characters blend with the background, like in this case. As our friend Paul puts it, in film noir, the character is likely to be standing in the shadow. When the environment is given an equal or greater weight than the actor, it, of course, creates a fatalistic, hopeless mood. There's nothing the protagonist can do. The city will outlast and negate even its best efforts. This technique is certainly very effective in creating a dark and mysterious tone which gives the audience the notion that danger could be lurking just around every corner. But lighting isn't the only cinematography technique used in film noir. The style of filmmaking is also famous for taking full advantage of frame composition to create tension. The following is a classic scene that demonstrates film noir's ability to let us feel who has the power in a scene and who doesn't. This is from 1949, The Setup. In the first portion of this sequence, Bill Stalker Thompson, played by Robert Ryan, comes out triumphant from his fight with Tiger Nelson, as shown by the low-angle shot. However, his triumph is abruptly stopped as Little Boy's thugs, a notorious gangster, block his way. He is then taken aback and surprised, suddenly occupying less space in the frame. This subtle shift sends the character from a position of power and triumph to a position of growing weakness. From this moment on, Bill Stalker is shown progressively weaker and weaker as the thugs approach ready to harm him. The director only cuts to a close-up at the moment in which Stalker realizes that he is trapped, which then is followed by the shot getting wider once again, showing him at its weakest. I think these two shots back to back portray who holds the power in the scene. The thugs are shot with a low angle, looming above weak and trapped Stalker. The scene wraps up by presenting Stalker through a very high angle, enticing us to anticipate his inevitable danger. In the next part of the sequence, after Stalker gets beat up to a pulp, he is mostly shown through extreme wide shots. All of these shots look down on him, presenting him like a weak creature, stumbling around in the dark alleyways. The tension is in the contrast between the large space and how small the character appears. This is just one of the examples which demonstrate noir film's tendency and masterful ability to create tension through composition. Now, moving on to the next major characteristic of film noir, it is important to mention the classic narration. That rhymed. Although narration may be frowned upon today by some people, calling it lazy and an easy way to provide background story, narration had a special purpose in film noir. The style is characteristic for involving a great deal of internal conflict within the characters' minds, as well as presenting the plot in a very subjective manner. Narration then allows us to step into the character's mind. On top of that, it is a very useful device that directly reflects film noir's tendency to guide the audience through how things happened, rather than focusing on what happened. Here are some of examples of narration.
Between the eyes. She didn't fool me for a minute, not this time. I knew I had hold of a red-hot poker and the time to drop it was before it burned my hand off.
The dream she had clung to so desperately had enfolded her.
She'd said once that she liked picnics. We were on our way up the Mexican coast when he decided to stop.
As you can see, this device not only serves to provide the audience with important information needed to understand the complex stories of most noir films, but it also helps to give the movie a darker and melancholic mood, or as Schrader puts it, a predetermined fate and an all-enveloping hopelessness. Now for the next characteristic of film noir, here's a montage of people near water. Here's a montage of people in alleyways. These are just some of the recurring locations found in lots of noir films, and they have become part of the landmarks that make this style so unique. Lastly, another important aspect of film noir are the characters. Film noir is often identified by the presence of tough men and women. Men in film noir were boxers, detectives, and criminals who all shared a profound cynicism of the world and were a great deal of tough. On the other hand, the femme fatale, as Paul puts it, was the young heroine who is sick of going along for the ride and is now taking others for a ride. Even though both of these archetypes were borrowed from earlier styles of film and literature, especially the hard-boiled tradition, film noir was able to add them into the mix, which along with all the other characteristics helped to enhance the themes of pessimism, cynicism, and loss of hope in the ideologies of the time. This explains why some of the characters might react like this. That is a pretty tough guy if you ask me, and also a great deal of crazy. Now let's take a brief look at how film noir evolved through the ages. Paul states that film noir can be subdivided into three main categories: the pre-war era, the post-war realistic era, and the period of psychotic action and suicidal impulse. Remember this awesome scene we just saw? I think you know which era this one belongs to. So the first era, being the pre-war noir, was a lot less dark and fatalistic. The films had a lot more talk than action, and most scenes were filmed in tightly controlled sets. This period ran between 1941 and 1946. Some examples of these movies are The Maltese Falcon and Casablanca. Following this period came the post-war realism era. This period ran from 1945 to 1949. In this period, sets were not exclusively used and a variety of location shots can be observed. The films became much more realistic, adding to the feel of the city being as much of a character as any other human present in the film. The stories were also much more centered in exploring the themes of crime in the streets and political corruption. They were deemed by Schrader as street films, and although they were bolder than the earlier films, they were not as bold as what came later. The third and final era of film noir was the darker and more aesthetically piercing of the three. This period ran from 1949 to 1953, and it is considered by Schrader to be the best period of them all. He mentions that in these later years, noir films finally got down to the root causes of the period: the loss of public honor, heroic conventions, personal integrity, and finally, psychic stability. Paul sees this area as the epitome of noir films, as all of the elements that have been slowly added to the style finally became whole, truly forming a style of its own. Now, it was interesting to read Paul Schrader's notes on film noir, as his publication pointed out some really interesting facts in a time we now look back as history. His essay was published in the spring of 1972. He mentions that up until then, film noir had not been seen as a meaningful style worthy of study. Now, we know that it was during the 70s that American filmmakers and critics began looking at the films made 2 decades prior. Films such as Point Blank and Chinatown were released starting what is now known as the neo-noir films. For example, Blade Runner or Memento. However, up until the 70s, noir films, Paul mentions, were not given much praise because of their direct contradiction to the American character people wanted to uphold at the time. It was no wonder that the French were the first ones to begin studying it and imitating it. Overall, film noir left a huge legacy behind. I have already named a few films that employ some of the visual and thematic characteristics of film noir, but the list is a lot longer. Film noir was a style that was not afraid to contradict the American ideologies. These films were interested in placing the bad guy at the forefront of the film. On the other hand, the beautiful cinematography really pushed the boundaries of the kinds of tone and feel that a movie could achieve, thus allowing the medium to evolve. The stories were mature and complex, often placing the audience straight right into the action. And although far from portraying gender equality, the style portrayed women in a much more interesting and empowering way than even a lot of films do nowadays. I believe film noir to be a very influential and original style of filmmaking. It is a period worth studying, as I believe it can teach a lot about films, not only in the technical aspects, but also in the underlying layers that make it up. So this is the end of the video. I hope you learned something,